Thank you, Lisa, and thank you very much for having me today. It's an honor to be here. So I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so going through three primary questions. First question is, what is student-based budgeting? Secondly, why should districts adopt student-based budgeting? And third, what are the implications specifically for Georgia? I'm going to go through a lot of material, and some of it is semi-technical, but if you remember just one thing from my presentation, just remember this right here. This is the key takeaway, and that is equitable funding and educator empowerment does not stop at the district level. So we hear a lot about equity amongst districts and empowering districts to do more with their funding, but that doesn't stop from the state level to the district level. It has to be pushed down to the school and to the student level in order to be effective. So keep that in mind as we go through this presentation. So first, what is student-based budgeting? So it goes by a lot of different names that you might have heard of. Student-based allocation, weighted student formula, fair student funding. There's basically 4 or 5 words. You can put them in any order and it's all going to come out to be the same thing. And I like to use the term student-based budgeting. And the basic concept is this right here. It is the allocation of funds via weighted student formula based on student characteristics such as ELL, SPED, and poverty. And the big thing underlying the student-based budgeting is that an individual student receives the same amount of funding regardless of which school he or she attends. And that concept is known as funding portability. So the 2 big concepts are, one, funding is based on unique student need based on their characteristics, and 2, that funding attaches to the child in their backpack, so to speak, and follows them to whatever school that they might attend. And that's basically the gist of student-based budgeting. So it can actually be implemented at 2 different levels. So student-based budgeting can be from the state to the district level, as I alluded to earlier, and it can also be from the district to the school level. So regardless of what happens at the state level, student-based budgeting is a policy tool that can be implemented by districts regardless of how they're actually funded. For the purpose of this presentation, I'll be talking about the latter, which is district-based, student-based budgeting. So right now, across the US, there are about 30 plus districts that use some form of student-based budgeting. And it's very important to know, it's not a one-size-fits-all policy. Every district looks different in how they implement student-based budgeting and how it operates in practice. Student-based budgeting has been implemented for decades. Houston ISD first implemented it when Dr. Rod Page was there back in the mid-90s or so. But then you also have a lot of districts right now that are currently in pilot mode that are testing student-based budgeting and considering adopting SBB on a full-time basis. This is one example of a funding formula, of a weighted student formula. So as I said earlier, every formula, every district is going to look a little different based on their local priorities and needs. But this is the formula for Boston Public Schools. And as you can see, there's a base allocation of 1.3 to 1.8, and that varies by grade level because they made that determination that they wanted funding to vary based on grade level. But then you also have funding for characteristics such as special education, ELL, at risk, etc. So you have different weights that are attached to these student characteristics. And how this looks is, we have the student here, so we'll call her Susie. And Susie's in, let's say, the 7th grade, so she gets a base allocation of 1.3. And she's also eligible for free and reduced lunch. She's at risk, and so her total weight is 1.6. And of course, if she weren't at risk, then the weight would be 1.4, and so on. And this is unique to Susie. And so from there, to figure out how much funding she gets, you simply multiply that 1.6 weight by the base funding allocation of $3,832 to get Susie's total funding, which is just over $6,100. And of course, the basic concept is, regardless of which school Susie attends within the district, she's going to get that same amount of funding. All right. It's very important to realize though, we talk about dollars and cents, we talk about the weighted student formula, but student-based budgeting is much more than funding. It's actually based on a number of principles. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all of them in depth, but I will say a couple key ones. First, as I mentioned earlier, equitable funding is at the heart of student-based budgeting. So this is different than equal funding. So we're not funding all students equally, but we're funding students based on their characteristics and their individual needs, and that's where the equity comes from. And then also school autonomy. And so the purpose here of student-based budgeting is unlocking funds so that principals are empowered to use their resources as they see fit, based on the needs of their students and in schools. So principal autonomy, school autonomy, those are very important aspects of student-based budgeting, just as important as the actual funding aspect of it. So when we're thinking about student-based budgeting, it's easy to think about it as just a finance tool or a budgeting tool, but it's not. Properly implemented, it is actually an academic strategy that is also linked to finance. And so in terms of implementation, you really want to have academics involved, finance involved, and cross-functional team actually rolling this out at the district level. So why should districts adopt student-based budgeting? Of course, all those principles are reasons why they should adopt SBB. But really to get a grasp on why they would want to implement SBB, you really need to compare traditional budgeting with student-based budgeting. So the first point of comparison is resource allocation. In traditional budgeting, most resources are allocated via staffing ratios and programmatic allotments. So you get this kind of lumpy distribution of resources. Compared to that student-based budgeting, the resources actually flow down to the school in the form of cash, so dollars to spend flexibly based on student needs. So you're not getting the central office telling you, here are your resources, you're getting 5 staffing positions for this, 4 staffing positions over there. You're actually getting dollars which, for the most part, you can spend flexibly based on what your needs might be. And in terms of principal control, a traditional budgeting system will give principals about 1 to 5% autonomy over how they spend their funds. Compare that with student-based budgeting, SBB gives principals typically around 40%. So that range varies based on implementation, based on the district, but you might see that number anywhere between, let's say, 22% to maybe 50 plus, but typically it's around 40%. So obviously principal control is a big part of why a district might transition to student-based budgeting. There's one more reason I'm going to skip over this. One more point of comparison would be salary allotments. So in traditional budgeting, basically schools are charged for average salaries instead of actual salaries. And I'll show you how that works in a moment. Comparatively, in student-based budgeting, districts have the option of charging schools actual salaries for staff rather than just charging them for the average district-wide salary. And how that works looks a little bit like this. So this is traditional budgeting right here. So let's just say we have 2 teachers in a district, teacher A, teacher B. Teacher A has 1 year of experience, makes $47,000 based on the salary schedule. Teacher B has 25 years worth of experience, makes considerably more than teacher A, but the average teacher salary for that district is $54,825 because there's only 2 teachers. Now let's say there's only 2 schools, school 1, school 2. School 1 gets teacher A, which is the less experienced, cheaper teacher, and school 2 gets teacher B, which is the more experienced, expensive teacher. Instead of charging school number 1 for the average or for the actual salary of teacher A, what most districts do is they charge the average salary of $54,825 to their budget. So essentially, school number 1 is losing $7,825. And on the flip side of that, school 2 is gaining money because they're getting the more expensive teacher, and they're actually just being charged for the average teacher salary for that district. And so what you see here is a situation where quite often schools in low-income communities will subsidize the more expensive staff in schools in high-income communities. Given teacher sorting behavior where low-income communities will generally have less experienced, cheaper teachers, and the flip of that for high-income communities, you kind of see that transfer of funds, that subsidy taking place. So the key takeaway here is that traditional budgeting practices can compound school-level inequities and can also stifle principal innovation by not allowing them to spend their resources as they need to. So I'm going to go through a case study of Spring Branch Independent School District, which is located in Houston. It has about 35,000 students. They're actually a relatively innovative district. They do some interesting things with charter schools, and they have collaboration with ASprep and KIP as well. But they still use traditional budgeting. And because of that, their principals really aren't empowered to spend their resources flexibly. And so when you drill down to the school level, so we have an example of two schools here. So we have Northbrook High School and Memorial. And on the surface, they're very similar. Their enrollment numbers are similar, and the schools are actually only 3.1 miles apart. So on the surface, it looks pretty similar. But when you drill down, even though they're only 3.1 miles apart, the demographics could not be more different. So Memorial High School in blue, their population is about 10% economically disadvantaged compared to Northbrook, which is about 83%. And unfortunately, that plays out precisely as you would expect in terms of state test data. Clearly here, Memorial High School outperforms Northbrook across all subjects tested in the state STAR exam, so their outcomes are much better. So in terms of budgeting, Northbrook actually gets a little more per pupil, which is good, which is what you would expect. But when you really dig down beneath the surface, a different story might emerge. And here, you start by looking at their years of experience of their teachers. And so for Memorial, about 61% of their teachers have 11 plus years of experience, and for Northbrook, that number is about 41%. So clearly, Memorial has a much more experienced and therefore expensive staff. So key takeaway number one from this case study, schools in low-income communities tend to get less experience and cheaper teachers, even within the same district. So one point to stress here is like this is not a district versus district comparison, this is all within one school district. And then you look at their average salaries by position types. And across every type of position, so administration, professional support, and teachers, the average salary is higher for Memorial than it is for Northbrook. And now this is not necessarily a problem per se. So in and of itself, a principal might have a strategy of hiring inexperienced teachers who might be cheaper and really supporting them and putting a lot of money towards PD and support to get them up to a good level. But that's not what you're seeing here. Because, takeaway number two, because average salaries are used in budgeting, schools like Northbrook subsidize schools like Memorial, and cost savings can't be used elsewhere. So these cost savings that Northbrook have, they can't use them for things like professional development or technology or to hire teachers in other areas. Those cost savings are lost, and so they're in effect subsidizing schools like Memorial, which is problematic. The last point here of the case study is that in Spring Branch, their principals typically have only between 10 to 15% budget autonomy to decide how resources are allocated. And this is actually pretty high for a traditional school district. So it's good, it's relatively good compared to other systems using traditional budgeting, but compared to student-based budgeting, they basically don't have much autonomy in terms of allocating resources and aligning that to strategy. And so, takeaway number three of the case study, lack of autonomy means principals aren't empowered to effectively align resources with strategy. And I like to think of it as getting gift cards instead of actual cash to spend flexibly. So the result of this is lack of budgetary discretion for principals, but they still have accountability for results. And basically they can't allocate resources based on their school's priorities. And so actually I don't have time to go through the principal's role in student-based budgeting. I'm going to end on this point right here. So Right now, there are a lot of changes being proposed in Georgia, and it looks like the state will likely adopt them next year. And there's 3 key recommendations that the Education Reform Commission is making. Number 1, they're recommending the implementation of a transparent weighted student formula, and a big change to their methodology is including a weight for low-income students. And so this will go a long way in terms of driving equity and really allocating resources in a more equitable and transparent manner within Georgia. But then also they're making or proposing big changes to how teachers are compensated by giving districts more autonomy in determining how those pay scales look. So instead of dictating from the top what a pay scale looks like, they're going to allow districts to actually determine how to pay teachers and what factors to include. So these are all very positive changes and definitely a big step in the right direction. But at the same time, even with those positive changes, if equity and empowerment, if those things aren't pushed down to the school level, then you can have the best funding system in the world in Georgia, going from the state to the districts. But if that's not pushed down to the school level to impact students, then it's all for naught.